we see from the inception of humanity and the way it develops, it always develops through connections or in connections between people, but the kind of connection keeps changing. To begin with, it was a natural connection, natural instincts, like with animals, male, female, their offspring, and so they would develop until these families became larger and larger. They expanded, they became little peoples, as we see in ancient Bavel, as we are told of about those times. And there, the first revolution took place in human society when they began to feel that they can no longer live peacefully, quietly. Prior, they were as one people with one language, and suddenly they began to feel distance forming between them to the point of hatred. And here we begin to see that they required some adhesive to connect them together so that they could keep coexisting in a good, nice way. Because, yes, many different people exist there. They can be different to one another, even opposite to one another by nature, but there is something that unites them, connects them together, and thanks to that, they persist. And ultimately, they succeeded in finding two forms of development above the ego, above the distance that formed between them naturally. So, what transpired there? On the one hand, they understood that it's better for them to drift apart from one another, and on the other hand, their spiritual leader, one of their spiritual leaders, Avraham, he found a different method to the effect that we need to connect above all the differences. Love will cover all crimes. So you can follow nature, and then we have space. If you go left, I go right. If you go right, I go left, and so on. We can then exist, each one living in his own domain. And the second method is, despite the fact that we're all different, we connect together above all these differences, above the difference. So humanity, from that point, you could say, from that point, this is the way it exists. And the group of Avraham succeeded in undergoing all sorts of changes. It succeeded in adopting the method of connection, of the covenant, and it existed for about 1,500 years, like that. And the other peoples of Bavel, who were smaller, according to what Josephus Flavius recounts, they dispersed on the earth, and they became great nations and countries and so on and so forth. So this departure from one another, drifting apart, the more they drifted apart, they could continue existing, and if they made some covenants between them, they were such that do not demand the connection of love, but rather an external kind of connection, meaning each one can supply the other with something, even though there was no great need for that at the time. But in our times, we see the Industrial Revolution and so on, all these revolutions that we've gone through, the Cultural Revolution, and becoming integral humanity around the planet with all of our technologies, we see that we are again regressing to that ancient Babylon, as it was, in an unchanging kind of form, even though there are many peoples, the boundaries, the borders between the peoples become more obscure, they are erased even. But the matter of coexistence is still a problem. It's still problematic. So much so that even if we're not in actual conflict between people, between the nations, there are conflicts between forms of society, liberals, Democrats, socialists, capitalists, and so on and so forth. They have all sorts of factions. For one of the groups, a certain gender is important. For others, veganism and so on, that the animals live, and 1,001 different factions. Even though nationality didn't become so important, it sort of went down. But there are other indications, other lines according to which we are separated. And we see in our times that ultimately our evolution, our development, the process that we're undergoing, we're not setting it. We'd rather set something else for ourselves. But it goes on and advances despite of our ego, against our ego, and this process brings us closer to a state where we'll be even more opposite to one another. We'll be jobless, we won't have income, these 8 billion people won't be able to find an occupation for themselves, without education, without culture, without all of those values which they had before. We're coming to a very dangerous state, where if previously we could exist and have some natural human ties, now it's all vanishing. And in the near future, it seems that we'll truly develop, as the Kabbalists tell us, towards a direction where we'll have no alternative but to understand that only connection between people, which will be even more powerful than the natural connection, that of the family, we'll need that in order to survive. And therefore, here comes the wisdom of Kabbalah, an attempt to explain to us how to establish the connection, how to establish the proper connection, which is compatible or adapted to that same separation which nature reveals in us, and this covenant that we'll need to make between us, the covenant of salt. It is not naturally occurring, and it's not in a human kind of way where we understand that it's worthwhile for us, but rather it's of a spiritual form, where we'll have to understand that this is how we're built, in a system that compels us to be tied together, and this is called the system of Adam HaRishon, the soul, a system where the connection between us has to, although we start it, we begin to form it in a corporeal way, it has to reach all the way to, as it is said into the bones, through to the essence of our existence, the core of our existence, so that we'll be tied together as one body, as one heart, one soul, one mind. The system will have to be uniform to the full extent of that word. And so the covenant is called the covenant of salt, which has to be kept between us consciously, with our awareness, through our acceptance of the process and the ultimate outcome. And so the covenant of salt, we take on that form, we take on it as a goal which is eternal. It is pre-mandated, it compels us, it obligates us, and it is called the covenant of salt, which cannot be broken in any way by any individual or everyone together. So that is the system of the soul which we have to maintain. And so we have to learn how to do this. And again, I repeat, through lack of choice. There is no free choice involved. Rather, humanity is advancing towards a state where it'll be mandated. For us, it's as if we can determine in one direction or another, and we have choice, but we understand that this doesn't occur in nature. Rather, for now, for the time being, we can deliver the cure before the sickness, as it is said, before the punishment, for the blow. But humanity, there they will have to learn, to study what the covenant is about, namely the connection between the shattered, broken souls, which need to be connected together back again, and the connections need to be awakened, which exist. Though we do not use them, we don't know them, we'll have to find how to tie one with another, and the power of the connection, the intensity of it, which will keep growing, and all sorts of corporeal forms, and above the corporeal spiritual forms, such that these forms of connection will help us rebuild that uniform system called neshama, soul. And if we look at what's right ahead of us, then we'll be able to understand the process and the thought of creation, and how it's from the beginning of creation and through to our times, and from our times a bit into the future, and we'll be able to understand this trend, namely how to discover the method of connection, which is the wisdom of Kabbalah, alongside the shattering, the distance, which exists between the shattered parts, which felt themselves to be even more shattered, and why shattered, and where exactly is the shattering, which is the cause for hatred and separation, the cause of the family breaking apart, the family unit, and the problems within each and every nation, and so on, and between nations. And so, if we process all of these data, it'll be much easier for us to understand the process that we're taking part in, and what process humanity is undergoing, and we can then be in a mutual connection or interaction in order to receive their lacks and to lower down to them the method of connection. Questions? None. Very well. So, yes.